The first leaves of the weirwoods had just begun to stiffen with the bite of early frost when the singing fleet slid from its slips at White Harbor, each hull black smoothed with tar and studded along its rails with the glass-bright chimes that would give the armada its name. The masts wore arrays of taut crystal strings tuned by maesters until their notes married the deep hum that had begun to thread itself through the world in the years since the pillars rose. Under sails dyed the gray-green of northern seas, the ships took the wind like a choir inhaling together. Even the creak of their rigging sounded different, as if the ropes themselves understood the tune. Jon watched from the prow of the lead caravel, a blunt-bowed craft refitted from an Ibn whaler, its figurehead a wolf wrought from obsidian and ironwood, jaw ajar as if to bite the horizon. Daenerys stood beside him, cloak streaming, the dragon's circlet at her brow catching cold light. And there was a softness in her eyes as she looked over the decks that he had learned to recognize not as worry, but as love's particular kind of fear. Behind them, Regal hovered, vast wings throwing the sea's skin into scallops of shadow and sun. Alyssar flicked along the column like a bronze swallow, while Gyrax, pale and deliberate, glided sternward, her breath trailing a rime that sizzled where it kissed the water and then melted. On the piers, Sansa raised a hand. No long speeches now, only that brief, fierce gesture that bound duty to blood. Tyrion leaned on a bollard with a ledger tucked into his doublet, pretending to squint at the balance of grain versus timber while he stole one more glance at the sails he had costed line by line, column by column, for nights enough to sour even an accountant's humor. Samwell Tarly, Archmaester of Peoples, waved with ink-stained fingers until Arya tugged his sleeve and said if he wanted the fleet to return on the tide, he might consider letting the ropes cast off. They slid free at last. White Harbor narrowed to a throat of bobbing masts and shouting gulls. And then the sea opened, cold and iron gray as a thinking eye. Jon breathed it in, the old scent of salt and kelp and whale. Beneath it lay the new note he had come to expect wherever a pillar had been planted. The deep, almost inaudible purr that soldiers recognized in their bones as calm becoming readiness. The first leg took them south along the bight, hugging shore where cliffs broke into shelves of limestone and forest, then east past the fingers toward the narrow sea. Braavosi cogs crossed their path, their sails painted with the screaming eagles of the Sea Lord, but the Braavosi captains lowered their pennants in courtesy to wolf and dragon spreads. Once, a lean Myrish galley drew near enough for Jon to see the amber rings studding the oarsman's ears. The Myrish master sent a boy aboard with a jar of lamp oil that burned blue in salt wind and a note signed with an elegant S that Daenerys recognized as Salador San's newest paramour. "He grows old," she said, tucking the note away. "He grows generous." On the fourth day they anchored under the lee of a rock shaped like a sleeping dog to let a squall burn past. Jon stood at the rail while rain turned the sea to slate hammered under a smith's furious fist. Arya joined him with 2 cups of warm cider filched from the galley. "You hear it?" she asked, not looking at him. The storm's voice moved along the chime strings hung from the stays, warping their pitch and then letting it fall back true. "I do," he said, like a harp tuning itself. "I meant the other music," Arya said softly. "The one you only hear after you've bled for something." "Always," he replied. "I hear it even when I sleep." They made Volantis on the 10th day, skirting the black basalt towers and the elephant banners of the Triarchs that snapped above the old city like tongues tasting wealth. In the shadow of the long bridge, fishermen offered baskets of tiny silver eels. A priest of R'hllor in a robe sewn with fire opals shouted that a dragon queen had come to buy his god with mirror magic. Daenerys met his barbs with courtesy and coins for his orphan shelter and sailed at dusk to deny him any kind of public victory. "I am tired of being anyone's miracle," she said when the lights of the great bridge dissolved into starfall behind them. From Volantis they turned their bows to the Jade Sea. The nights there swelled hot and lush, the stars leaping close enough to pluck, the water tasting different, sweet, almost, as if some river of the world's youth emptied there. They threaded the Basilisk Isles at dawn, where slavers once hunted and men had been reduced to the arithmetic of weight and price. Jon stood among the tillers as they passed the ruins of a fortified camp taken 5 years ago by the Unsullied and converted into a hospital for those who still bore iron collar scars. From the shore, children scrambled down to wave. Behind them, the low red walls gleamed with fresh lime, and a sign over the gate read, in 4 languages, "Come without fear." Grey Worm had named it. He had not returned since. Karth rose from the haze like mirage made stone, and then like stone made mirage again. White walls flecked with lapis, towers shaped like spun sugar, perfumed wind that masked the underlying stench of midden and pearl merchants' sweat. The 13 were now 12. The 13th had died in a duel over who properly owned the shadow cast by his neighbor's tallest spire. They received the fleet in a hall chilled with blocks of imported ice and served Daenerys a sorbet made from lemon twists and milk of the poppy that they swore would open the eye of her heart. She ate 2 spoonfuls, smiled at the compliments offered to her children's beauty, and then asked to see their account books. "You still resent them for the locked gates," Tyrion whispered behind his hand as the Qartheen poured more wine. Daenerys did not answer. She reached into her sleeve and withdrew a single pearl that had rolled from a child's hand years ago into a gutter under those same white towers as she was turned away to die. She set the pearl on the table beside the decanter. The guildmasters studied it. No one said anything. By morning, for caravans loaded with rice and silk and dried citrus, had been pressed into the fleet's use as gesture of enduring friendship. And Daenerys had left the pearl on the plate at her setting and walked out into a day that smelled only of sea. They skirted Carcosa's rumored lights by choosing a longer course far south. The sailors told old stories over their bowls, of a city that could be seen only when the moon's shadow fell at the right angle and where men tasted their futures in cups of fermented fire. Arya sat with them and listened, kindly but without joining. She had learned long ago that a story's magic died when the teller felt measured. Sam spent those nights in the map room with a glass globe ground from Singer ice, tracing in smudged charcoal the lines of light that the disk had thrown onto the rafters at Winterfell. "If we keep to the old roads," he told Jon while tapping the vellum, "we'll miss the new ones entirely." "Then let's not keep to them," Jon said. So they took the ceviche route that the Cull had sketched with fish spines on the day of their goodbye feast. And then they bent that, too, when Jyrix tilted her odd, translucent head and banked south toward a glimmer Jon's gut said was not on any chart. The crew grumbled until the wind freshened by 2 points and sent them sliding into a bay that no Westerosi captain had logged, where the sea turned pale jade and the beach lay strewn with glass no human had dropped or polished. Creamy curls of melted sand, as if lightning had carved its signature into the shore and left behind specters of surf. They anchored there and camped. A tribe found them. Women who wore skirts woven from the leaves of a plant that smelled faintly of cinnamon. Men whose forearms were tattooed with a pattern of black scales. Children who ran like flickers of waterlight. Their language braided clicks with a bright, bell-like laughter. Their chief, an elder with hair like the down on the belly of a gull, touched Jyrix's pale claw and said a word that made every dog in the harbor lie down with its ears flat. Hushfire. They knew her kind, if not by sight. The elder led them into the jungle at dawn along a path so old the trees appeared to step back to reveal it. They walked between trunks as wide as towers and under fronds that held back the sun like the right hand of a king sparing a petitioner. The air smelled of water and rot and flowers so ripe they made Jon's teeth ache. When they reached a clearing, the elder lifted both hands and men and women altogether sang into the canopy. Birds answered. The ground trembled. Vines began to move, slowly and with obvious intent, parting to reveal a squat oblong stone buried chest-deep in the loam. It was black, with a gleam unlike obsidian, more viscous, oily. Even Sam, who prided himself on naming rocks the way other men named horses, could not say what it was. "The oily black stone," he said hoarsely after a moment, and let his hand fall. "It can't be. That's a thing from Sailor's Rotgut and Maester's Nightmares." Daenerys walked to stand over the exposed corner. Her face altered, not with fear alone. Recognition, perhaps. The stone seemed familiar to her in some intimate way she could not explain. She touched its skin, felt warm. She withdrew her fingers, but as she did the chime strings on the nearest mast thrummed once, as if something below were echoing them from a tremendous distance. "Mark it," Jon said. "We'll speak of this with Marwyn in Old Town on our way home. Or with the singers first," Arya put in. "Riddles." They sailed on. The Jade Sea opened to the wide shoulders of the Shadowlands, and there, set like a dead eye where the desert met the river, lay Ashai. Even after years of peace, even knowing they came now as guests and not as supplicants for prophecy, Jon felt the city's breath press common warmth from his chest. The light there had a quality unlike any other country's, thin and weak, as if it had far to walk and had grown tired on the journey. Shadows lay like silt, clung to wrists and bootheels. The river crawled through town as if it had a wound. Men and women walked slowly, veiled, and when they bowed, their joints made no sound. It was as if their bones, too, had learned to go softly to avoid waking something that slept beneath. A woman greeted them where the quay met the black steps that rose to the temple quarter. She wore a plain gray robe and a necklace made of 6 small bones. Her veil was not black but white, like the edge of a cloud against sun. "Welcome," she said, and when she lowered the veil her face had the precise beauty of a sculpture polished by 1,000 hands.
"Iam Guha."
"You remember." Daenerys looked at her for a long time. "I do." The rooms they were given smelled of anise and smoke. Sam discovered that the shelves were empty of scrolls but heavy with beeswax tapers. When he lit one, it sputtered green before turning gold. Arya found a table knife made of bone so smooth it felt like water. Jon could not sleep. He walked the corridors until dawn and found Kaith at the uppermost parapet, watching the pale river with her palms open on the stone, fingers spread like a page of writing waiting for words. "The net hums," she said without turning. "Ashai sits where 3 of its strings cross." "What sings on the other end?" Jon asked. "What has always sung," she said. "The world itself, its mother's names, its father's hunger, the wind that first learned to bend a grass blade." She looked at him then. "After your war, the song fell silent because there was only survival. Now that you have lived, it resumes." He did not pretend to understand. "The oily black stone," he said instead. "We have some," she said. "All ports do, in shapes that don't belong to human hands." "Who made it?" "Ask the ones who sit in the water and never drown," she replied. "Ask the chairs men fight to keep on islands that flood." He felt salt in his mouth, though they stood a league from the sea. "The deep ones," he muttered, remembering a half-drunk tale at Eastwatch by the sea. She smiled, just barely. "Lies are memories that cannot bear their own weight. Call them what you like. They had a note that does not harmonize with yours. It need not be war. There are notes that can sit beside others without eating them. But you must teach your pillars to listen as well as sing." "How?" He hated himself for the eagerness in the question. He had learned to distrust easy roads, and yet everything in him leaned forward like a man wishing a horse to clear a hedge. Kaith laid her palm against the dark stone. "Your daughter knows the cadence already. She carries the gate in her blood. Ask her to hear the shadow that has not yet chosen to be light." As she spoke, she looked not at Jon but past him, as if she saw Lyanna through a wall and a continent and a span of years all at once. They left Ashai before the city could seep into their skin. On the quay, Shadowbinders sang a chord to banish bad luck from the ships and another to keep the sailors' souls in their bodies should the sea forget the bargain of gravity. Jon tipped them with copper and with bread. "We sized these men with our fear," he said to Daenerys when they were out beyond the stone gray of the river and into the huge blue of the sea again. "They are only men, and women, and children, some kind, some cruel. The shadows are no one's monopoly." Daenerys smiled sideways at him, the expression both teasing and weary. "You needed to cross the world to learn what Ned taught all our lives?" He laughed. The sound blew off the water and came back in pieces. They turned west. The smoking sea lay like a cauldron to their right hand, breath steaming up from its broken heart. The sailors muttered and touched amulets and spat when their shadows crossed certain latitudes. The volcano, the 14 flames, though some were now only a weak breath, chuntered in the distances both seen and unseen. Rhaegal did not like flying there. He kept high and whispered with his wings, a black scribble sliding across a page of gray. Elisa rode the thermals carefully, sensing their torn edges. Gyrax alone seemed at home, drifting above the hot currents with uncanny poise, and once she dipped so low that her talons brushed the softened crust of a pumice field and drew out a sound like a bell struck with a feather. They saw things that no reliable book describes. A pillar of obsidian, hollow like a flue, rose out of the sea and sang, not because anyone touched it, but because the wind stroked it in just such a way that it had no choice. Inside it, Jon saw delicate threads like those within a bird's bone. One night the water to the west glowed with a pale blue fire as far as the horizon, and in the morning all the iron nails aboard had bloomed a powder-fine rust that the boatswain swept with a broom made of reeds and old prayers. Another night the stars arranged themselves into a pattern Jon had never seen, like two hands reaching for each other and not quite touching. "It's only a confluence," Sam said, peering through the ice lens. Jon closed his eyes and imagined the hands finishing their grip. Valyria came up not as a destination but as an interruption. The fleet slowed when the wind fell still and the chime strings lapsed into a silence that had weight. The smoking sea changed color, from pewter to the burnt sugar brown of a creme left too long on flame. Rocks broke the skin of the water, some black and broken, some fused into weird forms that looked disturbingly biological. The air smelled of rotten eggs and lightning. They had not meant to come into the ruins, not so close, but the current shouldered them like a crowd in a street after a brawl. They dropped hooks in a cove that was not a cove so much as a collapsed temple, half roof above them and broken arches framing the horizon. Arya climbed a corner wall and stood looking over the singing fleet with expression Jon vaguely remembered from long ago, when she had stood on the parapet at Winterfell and watched for the first snow. Sam sat on a lump of fused glass and read the story written there by layers of ash. Daenerys stood with her palms at her sides, eyes closed, and listened. Jon went a little ways off and found the ghost of a street along which no one had walked in for 100 years. At the second turning, the street dead-ended in a basin. In it lay a thing that looked like an egg. It was not. It was a brain of stone, lobed and veined, far taller than a man. Its shell was cracked in one place only, along a seam that might have been left by a god's fingernail. Jon raised a hand without understanding why and touched that seam. He had never dreamed in the day before. The world brightened in a way that had no light in it. He felt the moment when men who had just taught themselves to quarry stone decided to make slaves of the dragons who had taught themselves to bend fire. He felt the moment they remembered they were slaves themselves, to fear, to an idea of greatness so brittle it could only shatter and so contagious it had to be kept like glass that cut every hand that reached to carry it. He felt closer, this Daenerys in a house in Pentos, small and hungry and earnestly wanting only a door that locked against her brother's temper. And he saw Drogon break the sky above the Dothraki who had sworn to break her, and he saw Gyrex skating a pale web over winter water, and he saw his own hand on the hilt of a sword that had become a tuning fork for a world. He withdrew his palm. When he blinked the afterimage away, he discovered he had tears on his face. So did Daenerys, who had come up behind him without sound. They looked at one another, then at the stone brain. "Do you feel guilty?" she asked. "Yes," he said, "and grateful, and angry, and old." She smiled through the salt. "So do I." She took his fingers, turned his palm upward, kissed it. "So do I." They did not tarry in Valyria. Whatever answers lay, there were answers to questions they were not asking. The fleet reached the place Sam's runes and Kaith's cryptic guidance had named, and the Cull had drawn the way children draw a house. A square with a triangle for a roof. There was no island there. There was a shallow lift in the skin of the ocean, as if a fish had chosen that spot to labor and had not yet finished giving birth. The sea hummed. The pillars aboard ship trembled. Rhaegal flew to the precise center of that lift and hung there beating his wings but not moving an inch, the air resisting him with a will. Alecer could not stay still. He paced above and mewed. Gyrex descended until her shadow lay in a perfect oval on the water, and then she sank into it like a coin into a well. "Mother," Aegon said. His voice stayed steady because he had learned to hold it that way, but his jaw muscles worked. "She breathes water," Daenerys said, though she did not have the proof for it except the calm on a note none of them could hear. "She is made to cross that skin. She told us when she made frost from breath." The sailors thought otherwise. Men made old gestures against tempests. Women kissed icons of the maiden or the mother. Arya put her hand on the rail and looked for a knife she had not carried for 10 years that she might stab into the sea just to provoke an answer. Jon put his hand on her wrist and shook his head. It took 3 breaths or 3 hours. The sun at that latitude seemed to pulse in place. Then Gyrax appeared, shearing out of the surface, as if an invisible hand had thrown her back. Water sloughed from her in curtains. She threw her head and shrieked. No draconic trumpet, but a cry like wind shot along a cave. She flung herself above the singing fleet and cast that cry downward, and the crystal chimes along the rigging caught it and threw it back, and the world shifted. The water parted, no. The water changed, its tension altered, its notes slid. Where Gyrax had surfaced, the sea became glass. Not the black brittle of obsidian, but the clear heart of ice, except not cold to the touch. A platform rose, slowly, with the weight and unwilling grandeur of something old. Its surface bore the spiral ridges of something once living. It rose until it lay flush with the fleet's prows, a disk wide as half a city, glistening wet. In its center, an eye opened. Not an eye, a well, a mouth, a lens. Jon walked onto it with Sam, Daenerys, Arya, Aegon, Tyrion, and 6 Kull singers who had come aboard at the last port. They knelt, a mix of instinct and calculation, and placed their palms to the hard, warm surface. The lens filled with sky and then with a light deeper than sky. They saw, he did not know how to name it, the other side of resonance. Not pillars driven into land, but columns of sound like weave, strung by creatures large and slow who moved in water so thick it might have been time itself. The creatures sang without mouths. The song was not ale or war. It was not even love as men know it. It was the joy of a pressure equalized and a distance measured and a migration completed with a calf safely tucked into the undercurve of a fin. One of them turned whatever served it for an eye toward whatever served them for eyes. The Kull singers began to hum. Their pitch lay strange with the Westerosi ear, somewhere between major and minor. Jon breathed in and matched it. Daenerys followed, her alto like smoke over a coal's bed. Sam, quite without self-consciousness, bent his scholar's throat to the note. Arya sang the simplest part because that was what the song asked. Simplicity that made a bridge for names. Aegon clamped his lips in the first instant and then, seeing the child he had been at 10 still sitting somewhere inside him with his hands pressed flat to Winterfell's buttery table, he let himself open. The lens cleared. The thing beneath the sea unfurled an arm. It touched the disc where they knelt, gently as a woman lifting a newborn by the shoulders. There was no pain. There was instead that uncanny sensation of having one's bones rearranged in a better pattern. The pillar aboard ship hummed so hard it seemed it must shatter. Gyrax flung her head and cried again. Aleser answered with a gout of thin gold flame. Rhaegal set his jaws and sent a roar that became a drone and then a bell and then an organ note so huge that sailors fell to the deck and wept because they had forgotten what it was to feel human hands on their backs when they were 7 and their fathers had died in storms. The platform lowered. It did so without hurry, as if it had learned, this thing, to take pleasure in the idea of those above and those below sharing a single sound for a moment. Before it sank entirely, the lens hardened and a single, perfect droplet of that clear, hard, not ice, not glass rose like a bubble and sat at Daenerys' feet. It was the size of a cherry. She scooped it up and tucked it into her glove. She did not know why, only that it belonged in her pocket until it belonged somewhere else. That night the wind veered and the stars came closer than they had all voyage, as if the dome of the world had sagged toward them. The sailors slept without mutters. Jon lay awake and watched the plank above his head peel back into the rafters of the world's room. "We're only a story men tell to keep from being afraid in the bigger room," he whispered. Daenerys smiled, turned over, put his hand on her belly like a man who still could not quite believe his children had become half the size of the sky. They sailed home by a slower route because they had earned that, and because the poles of the realm tugged at them like responsibilities do. In Karth, the 13 were 12 again. In Volantis, the fire-drunk priest had built a kitchen that fed 200 souls each noon. In Bravos, the Sea Lord's eagle had lost one eye fighting a gull over a fish, and the bird seemed nobler with the damage. In Old Town, Marwyn measured the oily black stone they had marked with bronze rods and derived from its hum a frequency he said matched the sea stone chair on Pike. "Everything remembers itself," he said when Sam, who had become both his favorite student and his favorite irritation, pressed him too hard for the name of the makers. "Even when it cannot stand to." Winterfell took them in with the blunt, encompassing acceptance of a father who knows his children will leave in spring and go to war again someday. Lyanna had taken to the weirwood in their absence. She sat cross-legged beneath it with her hands in the roots and her eyes hawk-narrow, seeing maps beyond maps. Aegon fell asleep in his clothes on the bearskin on Jon's old chamber floor. Tyrion tumbled into the kitchens, kissed the cook full on the mouth, then sat with bowls of leek soup and asked her how the tax on flour had changed her life. Arya went to the rookery and slept among the ravens on the warm straw and woke with black feathers in her hair. "Do you know what to do with it?" Jon asked Daenerys when, hours later, after the young had been fed and the old had been settled and the counselors had been told just enough to let them sleep, they stood on the battlements and looked across the broad black world together. He meant the droplet in her glove. He meant Jyrix's second cry. He meant the platform at sea and the fingers below who had learned how to make their touches softer. "Not yet," she said. "The droplet might be a seed, or a bell, or a mirror." She lifted his hand. "The rest we already did. We sang back when something called. We bowed where we might have put our shoes on the table. We remembered who taught us to walk." He laughed. She smiled. The night breathed cold. The first flakes of the year took the air like one more kind of music. The years turned. That was their secret and their curse. The pillars held. The singing fleet multiplied until even the most suspicious hedgelord had grown used to seeing rigging strung with glass and sails dyed to take a tune better than wind. Marriages happened and failed and then happened again. Crops burned and sprouted and burned and sprouted. The Citadel grudgingly recognized the discipline Sam had invented, comparative peoples, and built him a wing where no one ate their porridge if he could help it. The Faith learned to sing a very simple chord at the end of funerals that made grief less like swallowing stones and more like putting a weight down without even knowing where one's hands had been aching. The oily black stones became curiosities that no one handled without a singer present. Sometimes they hummed, sometimes they sulked. The deep ones remained myth or memory, or a story men told to spice their stew. Every now and then a fisherman came in with a tale that made the tavern fall silent in that particular way that signals the time to buy him another cup. Rhaegal slowed and grew heavy in his bones. Drogon went one day to a cliff in the Stepstones where Daenerys had first learned to aim a dragon's fire and did not come back. He died in the air. They found him on the rocks at dawn, a heap of black that the tide licked at and could not move, and they sang while they burned him. Jon never forgot the scent of that smoke. It smelled of every pyre he had built for men, and also of a feast where an entire field ate together and told the truth because there was no point in lying. Lyanna grew into a kind of woman few songs know what to do with, fiercely gentle, precise, and unashamed of not needing to be forgiven. She could ride Jyrix standing if the wind lay a certain way, and when she descended to the pillars and pressed her palm to their sides, the cracks that had begun to appear after a storm smoothed themselves as if an invisible hand had run along them and said, "Hush now." Aegon married for alliance and for love in that order twice. Both wives outlived him. He died on the open sea with a Lysur's wing shadow covering half the deck and his hand in that of a sailor who had no title and gave not a fig for titles but loved him because Aegon had once held a pot so that man could piss when he had the fever. Tyrion, who had sworn he would not write his own songs, began his memoir in secret and then destroyed it the night a child read aloud a passage about a brothel and then asked what a brothel was with such frankness that he laughed and burned the pages without regret. He died after a supper of mushrooms while telling a joke about a nun and a crossbow. He did not finish the punchline. Arya went east one last time and came back with 10 children she had picked up along various roads by refusing to leave them where they lay. She refused to admit she had done this and required Sansa to be the one to assign tutors. She still carried no weapons because by then everyone understood she herself was the weapon. Sam lived to be so old that the apprentices forgot the boy who had once cried on the wall and saw only the man who knew how to deal with a girl who would never sit still and a boy who thought tearing pages from books was a lecture's proper end. He died with his cheek on an open codex whose ink had not yet dried and whose last sentence trailed off midword. Jon and Daenerys learned to sleep holding hands, not because they feared the night, but because it pleased them to find the other even in dreams. When they finally gave the droplet to Lyanna, she held it up so that the light from the heart tree fell through it and the entire gods would scattered with small, needless rainbows. The seed did not grow. The bell did not ring. The mirror did not show anything but a distorted sky. Daenerys laughed. "Sometimes a gift is only a gift," she said, and she poured a drop of wine on the root of the tree and another on the stone at its base. In the end, it was not war that came back, but a winter without teeth. A long breath that made everyone learn again how to go slowly. Men said it was the pillars that had softened it. Others said it was luck. Sansa, white-haired and bright-eyed, said it was because they had learned to share the work of fear. "I did not invent that," she said when a child asked Ernest if she had. "The cooks taught me." Jon's hair went silver all at once, in an autumn that brought too many funerals even for a peaceable year. He found he did not mind. He had outlived the man he once thought he was. He had become the sort of king no songs know where to put. He knew this because whenever someone attempted to sing about him, they ended up singing about a bridge, a winter without screaming, a woman who had learned to take off her veil, or a fisherman whose spine no longer ached because a pillar had shifted the wind. A week before the anniversary feast that would mark 100 turns of the sun since the Night King shattered in a scream of blue light and calving ice, Jon woke in the hour when owls return and milkers stand, and knew. He dressed without a candle. He had learned the castle's night face a lifetime ago, and climbed to the parapet without thinking about the cold. Rhaegal lay coiled on the snow like a hill that breathes, his great green eye open and mild. Gyrax sat on the merlin, her pale feet tucked up, her breath making filigree that the air took apart and forgot. She turned her head as he came and then looked east where the world would be sooner than later. The aurora had come down, a curtain of green and white that moved as if hands somewhere drew it aside so the stage could be reset between acts. The pillars hummed so softly that only men and women with scars that knew how to listen could hear them. He put his palm on the stone as he had always done. The old scar across his throat prickled into warmth. It felt less every year like a brand and more like a string in an instrument that had learned where to sit in the chord. Daenerys came and stood beside him, in her night shift and a cloak thrown across shoulders, hair unbraided and loose. She took his hand. They watched dawn. "I dreamed we were walking through a field of barley," she said at last. The heads were the color of Rhaegal's eyes. "We were talking about whether to buy a goat." "We do not need a goat," he said. "We have a castle." She laughed. "I want a goat because the child I was once wanted a goat because no one would ever let her have one." "Then we will ask Sansa to send for a goat," he said gravely, "and we will put ribbons on its horns." They did not say goodbye because they had learned that goodbyes make too much of what should be as unavoidable as breath. When the sun lifted above the rim and lit the face of the heart tree and the pillars thrummed in a tone that made men who were cutting would pause their axes midair and smile without knowing why, Jon felt something relax inside him that had been clenched since a night in a snowstorm where he had met a thing that named itself only in cold. He exhaled. It made a cloud and then it didn't. Later, an hour, a day, a season, people would say a star appeared where none had been before and that it had the color of frost in sunlight. They would name it 100 names. Children would call it dawnfire and stick out their tongues to taste snow that had nothing to do with winter. Scholars would draw the same diagrams 100 times with chalk that wore to nubs and feel satisfied. The coal would sing into cups and the cups would ring. A shepherd on a hill in the Reach would look up and weep because he had dreamed such a star when he was 9 and the Lord took the ewe his family needed to live. When Daenerys came back from the parapet with her hair streaming silver and her feet making no sound on the stone, she told Lyanna to wake the cooks because they would need bread enough for a feast even if the invitations had not gone out yet. When Lyanna asked why, she said because today would be a day when men were kind to one another because they had remembered to be, and such days ask for butter. Arya sharpened a stick and gave it to a child to roast a sausage over the first flames of the morning. Aegon taught a sailor to tie a knot that would not slip in whatever weather the sea had decided to rehearse. Jon's name became a kind of weather itself, The sort of day when the sky cannot decide whether to rain and so instead carries the scent of rain to the edges of the fields so that the barley lifts its head. He would have laughed at this. He would have told the bard to sing about someone else. But the song refused him. It kept going back to bridges and pillars and hands in the dark finding other hands. Years later, seasons enough for apples to sweeten and go soft and sweeten again. Children played dragons and wolves in the orchard behind the kitchens. One girl pinned a boy with a pounce that took both of them into the straw and told him he could not breathe fire until his breath had learned to be quiet first. A woman with hair like spun silver put her hand on the tree beside them and listened for a hum she had never stopped hearing. In the distance, a boat moved down a river and then slid into the sea, and as it went past the last bend before the horizon, it rang every chime on its mast with a wind that carried no sound. A goat stood in the kitchen doorway, nibbling ribbon from its horns. Far away, in water too clear for sound to travel, and yet now it did. Something enormous turned on its side to feel the warmth along its length. It sang. Nothing on the surface heard it. Everything did. No one built a statue. It would have fallen over. They built a school at the foot of the wall where watchmen once had counted days, where children stood hand in hand and learned that songs can be recipes, and recipes can be prayers, and prayers can be treaties, and treaties can be lullabies. In one classroom, a teacher wrote on a slate with her left hand and said, without turning, to a boy who had begun to cry, "You are not alone." He wasn't. He had never been, but now he felt it. And when someone asked, as someone always will, if the story ended happily, the answer came the way the pillars sang. Not in words, but in a pressure equalized, in a distance measured then crossed, in a small hand slipping into a large one, in a goat who did not run even when fire crackled, in a winter that taught men how to walk softly, in a dawn that took a very long time to arrive and then would not leave. The wind that peeled down off the wall carried a scent that no one had quite learned to name, and no one needed to. It was rosemary on a broken stone. It was powdered ice. It was dragon smoke gone cold and sweet. It was the hinge of time. It was the sort of air you breathe, and then all of a sudden you realize you have been breathing all along. The day the weirwood leaves took on the first hard edge of cold again, Lyanna woke with sap in her mouth. It was not a taste she could name, not honey and not blood. Something resinous that gripped the tongue and then thinned to a clean chill like snowmelt. She lay a long moment listening. The godswood answered with its usual small talk. Winter thrushes, the furred scuttle of a stoat in roots, water ticking into the pond from the hidden spring. But underneath ran a new thread, a high, taut line as delicate as a glass hair and as impossible to ignore as a cut. It vibrated in her teeth. She pulled on wool boots, a cloak that smelled faintly of Gyrix's frost, and went barefoot from the ankles down to hear the flagstones. The castle breathed. Night fires had fallen to ember. The kitchens hummed. Someone on the eastern wall coughed and spat and apologized to no one. When she stepped under the heart tree, the pulse in her teeth leaped to meet the slow drum in the trunk. She put her palm on bark that held the memory of 10,000 palms. The line steadied, not louder but more sure. "You heard it too," Jon said. He was already there, dark in the pre-dawn, cloak thrown carelessly, hair silver at the temples gone wild with sleep. He gave her a mug of nettle tea. "It's the sea." She nodded. "The west. Pike," he said, as if the name itself were a sour pit. Bran's raven came in the second watch. The sea stone chair hums. The naga bones sing back. Storms rolled all night and then sat offshore like watching men. Yara's old. Her nephew keeps the strand fires. He can't hold both prayer and panic. Daenerys came through the birch screen, hood up, breath making the faintest cloud. She had a hand around a small cloth bag. The shape pressed through was a cherry-sized sphere. The droplet, Lyanna realized. The clear hard not ice from the day the sea gave them back their song. The queen's eyes had that look Lyanna knew well by now, a brightness that meant decision. Gyrix wheeled low over the godswood, pale shadow, then slid away west as if the dragon herself had scented the tune. "We go," Daenerys said simply. She tucked the little sphere away and looked to Jon. The look between them was long practice, a chord that needed no conductor. "Winds are good. Regal can be there by dusk if the front holds." "Aegon," Lyanna asked. On Elysir, Jon answered. You stay. Lyanna made a face. You stay, Daenerys repeated, softer but steel. The pillars bend toward you now. If this is nothing but a storm's trick, they'll want your hand here anyway to quiet it. If it is more, we may need you where the net is strongest. Lyanna thought of the first time she had pressed her blood into the weirwood and felt the cold open like a door. She thought of the times since when she had set her palm to obsidian and felt the pillar sigh, the way an animal does when the burr comes free. She wanted the sky and the sea, and yet she felt the rightness too. All right, she said. And because she was her mother's daughter, she bent and kissed Daenerys' cheek, and because she was her father's daughter, she squeezed Jon's wrist, and because she was herself, she whistled once, low, and Gyric skimmed the heart tree with a hiss like a laugh. They took the western road in a gray light that decided to be rain and then decided otherwise. Rhaegal launched from the Wolf's Head Tower, the slate shingles shedding a wash of water under the first stroke of his wings. He rose, and the yards below seemed to draw toward him as a magnet draws iron filings. Men and women lifting their faces, mouths ajar, small as prayer in that moment between cold and heat. Drogon was gone. Even years on, the lack of his black mass above Winterfell cut a darker shape than cloud. Rhaegal's deep green took it gently. Elysir darted out from the east stables to join, a bright copper flicker, Aegon a sure speck on his back. From the far parapet, Arya raised 2 fingers in something between salute and promise. Sam was behind her, squinting through his glass and trying not to look like a man who would trip over his own robe staring up. They flew with the weather. Jon had learned to read wind like a line of ink now. The land below flickered from brown to iron to a green that clung to low ground as if it feared the sky. The first fingers of the Cape of Eagles prodded into the sea. Then the horizon broke open and the world lay breathing. Rhaegal stooped lower and took the onshore surge like a dancer, letting it shove him a little to learn its weight and then pushing back with lazy contempt. The farther west they went, the more the sea shouldered, a swell that grew without whitecaps, heaving from a long way out. When Pike rose from the gray sheets, the surf around it looked like muscle under skin. The Iron Islands had always presented a kind of honest ugliness that Jon appreciated, stone speaking its one-syllable word over and over until you stopped trying to hear more. Today there were more words. A line of men in heavy oilskins stood along the strand above the highest tide mark under Naga's Hill, torches guttering in wind that smelled like old copper. Beyond them, in the hollow where the Sea King's bones lay, 30 rib arches rose against the sky like the fingers of a giant learning to play a harp. Lightning rooted in the far west, 3 forks at once, and kept its light, the way some lightning does when the air decides to hold on to it. Yara met them with her hood thrown back, hair white now as foam. The scar Euron had given her risen like a tide mark. She laughed when Rhaegal's wind took her cloak and tried to yank it off, and she laughed when Jon landed hard and nearly went to a knee, and only when Daenerys slid from the harness did she stop, and then only because she drew breath. "Queen," she said and bowed. A gesture that 10 years ago would have had edge. Now it held zero heat. Even the Iron Islands soften if salt sits long enough. "Yara," Daenerys replied, "your message rang our towers." The old Reaver's mouth twisted. "The chair hums like a drunk in his cups," she said. "And every time it does, a woman's child on Harlaw wakes with blood from the ear. I've no use for ghosts that pull like undertow." Jon looked past her to the sea stone chair. He had seen it before, on the day he and Daenerys took the Iron Pledge and made the Salvage Guild official and saw old men weep to speak oaths that did not taste like choking. He had sat in it once and felt nothing but the weight in the stone that comes when you sit in something too many dead men have fought to keep. Today the chair looked the same, black, oily, old, until his eyes adjusted, and then he saw the unstill. The surface did not sway. It crawled slowly, as if the stone were trying to remember being liquid. He went up the hill without waiting to be announced. He put his hand to the chair's back. A small hum came into his wrist, traveled elbow to shoulder to throat to skull. He shut his eyes and let it in. The note was wrong, not evil. Wrong, like a string brought tight to the correct pitch and then tightened further by a child who wants more music and does not understand what breaks. "Who tightened it?" he asked, eyes still shut. Yara snorted. "I don't tune chairs," she said. "Ask your pillars. Ask your bugs in lanterns. Ask the damned sea." My nephew says the hum began after the last pillar set on the last light point. Daenerys came to lay her palm beside his. The wrongness slid across her bones too. She reached with the other hand into her glove, pulled out the droplet. The sphere caught no light and all light at once. The palm just above it cooled, then warmed, then settled. Jyrix hissed softly and settled her pale belly against the old sloping rock as if she meant to warm an egg with frost. "Here," Daenerys said and crouched, and let the droplet roll into the deepest groove of the chair's arm the way a bead of rain finds the line a craftsman carved 2,000 years ago and decides to obey. It came to rest in a pit worn by a king's ring long dead. It did not glow. It did not hum. It simply sat. The wrong note eased a fraction. The men on the strand did not hear the difference, and yet they shifted their feet and breathed again as if a throat loosened. The ghosts, if there were ghosts, drew back half a step. Yara squinted, her eye corners pulling years into brackets. "All right," she said. "If you're going to make my rock sing in a key that doesn't curdle fish, we'll stand quiet for your witchcraft." "It's not witchcraft," Arya said behind her, and the Ironborn flinched in spite of themselves. They always did when a Stark's voice came out of nowhere. Arya pulled back her hood. Hair bristled from wind and climb. Two cool singers at her shoulder with their jade lines and steady eyes. "It's listening," she said. She nudged the droplet with one fingertip no man in the Isles would have dared use on the chair. "And manners." Jon hid a smile in his collar. "The pillars pulled the chair's note," he said. "For those who needed a reason and a story both. Not to break it. To speak to it not like a jailer to a prisoner, but like a fellow guard on shift. It needs to give its weight to the net. It tried to give too much. We need to teach it how to lean." "And how do you teach a piece of God's pissed stone?" Yara demanded, equal parts skeptical and resigned. "You sing to it," the older of the Cole said, his clicks soft. He regarded the chair as if it were a shy animal poised to bolt. "And you ask it what it is instead of telling it what you need," they sang. "Not long. No ceremony holds a sea's patience if you make it stand too long on a hill, but true." The Cole wove the low line. Arya took the simple melody a child could learn without being told it was a melody. Daenerys' alto braided in. Jon hummed because singing meant showing one's throat. Jyrix lay her head down and let small bells of frost form around her nostrils and then, on an exhale, turned to rain. The droplet in the groove did nothing that anyone could see. The wrongness untwisted a fraction more and then went still. He felt it then. Not in his throat or fingers on stone, but underfoot, traveling from the chair into the hill, down the hill into the ribs and all along the strand. The bones of the Sea Kings hummed not in pain but in the pleasure of weight rediscovered. Far out, a dark line that had been thinking about becoming a storm stopped thinking and fell flat. The sudden quiet made ears ring. Men looked at each other and then down, as if ashamed of their relief. Yara grunted. "If you insist on making peace with rocks," she said, her mouth shaping a smile that had nothing kind in it and everything kind beside, "you might as well stay for stew." They did. Ironborn stew always tasted like something that had almost drowned and decided not to. Regal drank from the deep channel between Pike and Saltcliffe and blew a ring of steam that drifted under the rope bridge and made 3 children laugh and their mother curse and then laugh too. Aleaser landed on the wreck of a Reaver longboat and pulled it in by the stern so the salvage guild could strip its copper clean. Men argued over rates. Tyrion would have been happy. Jon found he missed him then with a physical jolt, as if the wind had thrown a handful of grit into his eye. That night, Yara took them down into the chamber under the hill, to the place where the last living priests of the drowned gods still poured a cup of sea over every child's head, though none held infants under until they stopped and started again anymore. The old god had found he could live without worship that killed quite so many of his prayers. They looked at the bowl cut from bedrock and at the little copper eels that had made the pool their nursery longer than any man could remember, and Daenerys put the droplet in her palm and the high priestess. Once a girl with a mouth like a knife, now a woman whose knives had been turned into fishing hooks, raised an eyebrow and nodded, as if to say that will do then. They left at dawn. The west smiled behind them for the first time in 3 storms. When they reached Winterfell simultaneously with Yara's raven born on quicker wind, Lyanna had the pillars humming in a key that matched what the sea stone chair had learned. Men slept hard in boats and did not wake to find their ears bleeding. The realm wished to race on the strength of good news. It never could for long. Old Town called next. Marwyn's letter arrived on paper that smelled faintly of fish glue. He wrote like a man scratching at a door in the night. Hightower's foundations sing a note I do not like. It is the oily stone. It taught itself a harmony while we slept, and it learned it from something that does not breathe. Bring the droplet. Bring your daughter. Bring a dragon that does not mind narrow streets. Daenerys laughed once when she read that, short and without music. The image of Drogon's great body wedged between Old Town's tower and the Citadel's copper dome was comic and not. We take Regal to the river mouth, she said. Gyrex with Lyanna above the tower itself. And Aegon to keep the harbor men from trying to poke at her with poles if she breathes on their rigging. Sam will have strong opinions, Jon said. Sam is why Marwyn wrote Bring Your Daughter, Daenerys replied. He cannot sing the oily stone awake by himself no matter how many pages he turns. Old Town swelled up from the low country like a man who had eaten too much and yet kept eating. The high tower pried at the sky at its center, long and white and occasionally beautiful, and around it the city lay with its arthritic elbows stuck out, canals gone green around the edges. The citadel's linked rings gleamed here and there where a copper disc caught light. The harbor threw a stink that even white ravens could not entirely tidy. Jon loved it the way he loved scars on hands that had done honest labor. It wasn't pretty unless you looked with the kind of eye that had learned to love function. Marwyn met them at the river mouth, not because he wished to be first to greet the king and queen, but because he wished to get the measure of Regal's wing beat at harbor level. His hair had gone to white wire. He had added a black link to his chain that no one could find the text to match. He embraced Sam, who had come all the way down from the new wing with his own train of anxious boys, and then he stuck his pinky into Elyser's mouth when the dragon snapped at him and laughed when the Copper Prince flinched. Come, then, the Archmaester said, and led, and the city parted for them because 2 dragons over its main thoroughfare and the Stark and Targaryen banners in the same wind will part any city. The high tower's lower stones held that unclean gleam Lyanna had learned to spot even under whitewash. Where the mortar cracked, the blackness breathed through like oil vexed by seep. She pressed her palm to the dressed face in the alley behind the tallow man's shop and felt a slow, revolving pressure the way one feels a whale below a boat. It was not hunger, it was indifference. The note it sang had no room for listening. She went up and up again, to the wind-bitten plateau beneath the light where gulls had learned not to foul and sailors would pass a coin along the rail when the lantern lit. The wind there knocked the breath out of you in winter and lifted your hair until you wore a halo in summer. She stood in the lee of the great lanterns housing with Gyrex's pale shadow sprawled across the slates and looked down to the high tower's bones, standing inside a long white throat and listening to a stomach she did not like. Marwyn pressed the droplet into her palm. It will know where to go, he said. Will it? She asked. When you know where to put it, he said. I don't, she said. You do, he said, and then kindly, you will. She laughed despite herself. Below, in the foundations, Jon and Daenerys descended into a heat that had nothing to do with fire. The oily stone made the air itself slick. Light became reluctant. Men moved torches gently because to wave them felt rude. Jon set his palm to one face and felt again that pressured indifference, and beneath it a faint chittering, like crabs at night on a strand. He did not know if the crabs came from his mind or the stones. He withdrew his hand without embarrassment. Once we thought this a devil, the high tower steward with them said, voice respectful without supplication. Then we thought it a friend who would hold up our tower when the ground's own bones were soft. Now we think it is neither. He spread his hands, palms up the way a man shows he is not hiding hooks. We will do as you ask. We will do as the stone asks, Daenerys corrected and smiled to take the edge away. Lyanna's hands found it at dusk. The droplet had warmed in her palm as she climbed and cooled when she hesitated and warmed again when she stepped forward. She tucked it under the lantern housing where stone had been chiseled with a maker's sigil. 3 waves and a tower, old and proud. And found a niche beneath the emblem that showed tool marks so fresh it seemed the mason had only just put down his chisel. No one had carved there in a century. She placed the droplet. The lantern glass flashed white, then dark, then green. Down in the foundations, Jon felt the oily stone shift its shoulder once and then lie back. In the harbor, the swell, which had been trying to come from 2 directions at once all afternoon while fishermen swore and pretended not to be afraid, remembered a single source and lay down in long, sweet breaths. High on the tower, Gyrax put her forehead to the glass and let a brush of frost draw spiderwebs there. The lamp's flame did not waver. In the white room of the citadel where Sam kept a pot of willow tea on a brazier solely because old men needed their hands wrapped around warmth while they learned, the bell that had been brought from Valyria the year the first dragons sailed west trembled once, and then took on a tone so simple that the novice carrying books burst into tears, put all his books down, and then laughed at himself without shame. "What did it say?" a boy asked, mortified that he too felt his throat thicken. Sam poured tea and answered. It said, "Yes, they slept in Old Town, no court show, no feast. They ate mussels in broth like brine and laughed when a crab pinched Aegon's finger through the bag. In the morning, Jon woke to the smell of old parchment and river and tower stone and garlic on his hand from the bread. He had torn the night before and knew he was still alive and that the world wanted him to remember it in a way that made the very old and the very young nod at him when he passed. They turned north. The pillars sang them through the Mander's mouth and up the coast. Men lifted caps along the quays and women raised babies to look from shaded porches because dragons in the morning taught courage to sit still. The weather had decided to be kind. Then it changed its mind on a whim and sent sleet off the sunset sea like thrown pebbles. Regal bellowed. Gyrax sliced. Alyssur did ridiculous tricks and made Aegon swear and laugh at once. At Winterfell, the goats had developed a taste for ribbons. Jon scolded without heat and tied new bows. Sansa sent more from White Harbor with a note that read, "If you feed goats ribbons, you will soon be making your own ribbon." He smiled and draped one around Lyanna's neck as she came through the gate, hands smudged with sap and stone dust, hair full of errant weirwood seeds that no comb seemed to clear. She kissed his cheek and Daenerys's and then climbed the wall because she could no longer bear not to be looking down at the net when she felt it. What came then came from far out, beyond the last light, beyond the flows. The pillars felt it first, their hum going faint and then loud and then thin again, like a heart trying to find the beat after running. Men on the wall gripped the black glass and stared west even though the first history had taught them to stare north. The coals stopped mid-sentence and turned their faces as a flock turns. Arya put her ear to the stones under the walkway and closed her eyes. Sam lifted his lens to a patch of sky that showed nothing yet and breathed like he was counting backward from 10 as a midwife tells you to do when fear starts talking too fast. It broke not like a storm, but like the breath one takes after being under too long. The horizon rose, physics winked, and then laid down. Men cursed and then laughed as if they had stumbled and not fallen. A line of pale knot clouds seemed to right itself from where the sea curved to the place where the sun peered, thin and steady. Then the sound came, so low you only knew it had begun because the hair on your wrist and the back of your neck lifted. Lyanna pressed both hands to the parapet and then reached back blindly for Daenerys's and Jon's. They took them, not because they needed to but because touch draws lines you need. Gyrax coiled and poised. Regal went still. The old dragon, so loud and joyful in his youth, had become a wise silence. Alyssur, who should have been unable to stand quiet, stood quiet. The voice rose, not a voice, a pressure made shape, and the pillars answered one by one in the order they had been planted, like lamps being lit down a street toward home. The sound came ashore and into the stones. It did not ask permission. It did not demand surrender. It came the way a tide comes when a moon decides to be nearer than usual. Where there was resistance, it went around. Where there was fear, it drew back and waited until someone remembered they were not alone. When it reached Winterfell, it changed key. The clear hard droplet under the high tower lantern sang. The droplet in the sea stone chair's groove chimed. The chimes along the singing fleets rigging 3 coasts away pulsed once as if a god had plucked them with a thumbnail. And then the note took on a layer not of whales or pillars or dragon breath, but of something else that had been listening to all of this for years without being seen. The whisper of blood teaching itself to be kind. Men on the battlements lowered their hands without meaning to and cupped the air as if to drink. Children laughed because laughter and this sound liked each other. Cooks stopped salted hands mid-throw and let the salt drift. Somewhere a goat did not eat a ribbon because even goats recognize when a field should be still. Daenerys's face lifted, eyes gone wide the way Jon had seen them only twice. Once when Drogon had first flown at her command. Once when Lyanna had breathed a first breath. "Do you hear it?" she whispered, as if fear might startle it. Jon nodded. He did not trust his throat. Lyanna closed her eyes. She slid one hand free and set her palm to the parapet stone. The weirwood sighed. The note changed again, no less deep, no less big, only tuned to include something inhuman that had decided it liked the way the human note made its own throat feel. Jyrix opened her mouth and made a sound that was not a trumpet and not a hiss and not anything the world had named yet. It climbed the note like a vine and did not choke it. And then, because it was enough, the sound passed. It did not fade. It moved on. The pillars set a shoulder against the tide and held their shape. The air settled into its older breath. Men looked at each other with the awkwardness of people who have shared something intimate without talking about it first. A baby began to cry and then was comforted with a piece of apple and a rhyme. Regal sneezed. Aleser cuffed him in dragon way as if to say, "You old brute." Jyrix dove like a seam of pale silk falling from a table, and then caught herself so that the gout of frost she loosed drifted down on the yard like an idea for winter that no one feared. "What was it?" Aegon asked, dazed and grinning, hair in his eyes, one ribbon chewed by a goat in his hand. He would always be this way when Aw found him, boyish, the crown nowhere. "Hello?" Daenerys said and laughed, and leaned her head on Jon's shoulder, and let herself be the woman who had wanted a goat and gotten a world with goats in it instead. Word went out without ravens. Songs passed things along much more efficiently than crows ever could. A phrase learned in a kitchen made it to a brewery that made it to a dock that made it to a ship that made it to a woman knitting on a step who sang it under her breath and made a man look up and see a sky that had just remembered how to be kind. Old Town observed a tide that did not line up with the moon in the tables, but that sailors recognized with their bones. Pike's chair did not hum itself raw again, but when a boy under Naga's hill set his ear to a rib to see if he could make it sing, he did. And the note made his father weep for a man he had killed and forgive himself without forgetting. In Karth, a pearl trader put a pearl on a plate where a queen would sit and then left it there for someone else to find decades later and think some old story had happened to a real person. In the weeks after, the weather could not make its mind up how generous to be. Crops came up late and then fast. A school at the wall taught children to read the old tongues and the new notes both. A boy from the Yew Woods of the Riverlands wrote a chant in 3 lines that his sister used to calm a horse, and that a fisherman used to steady his hands, and that a hedge which used to end a fever without touching the patient. In the Far East, a priest of a god no Westerosi had ever heard of took off his shoes on a day when his god's river turned blue with fish he had not expected and walked through the market blessing everyone he passed by name. And later that evening, when his wife told him to leave the goat out of the house, he laughed until he cried. Years do their work. They took men and women. They left stones and stories. Sansa died with hands around a mug and a ledger on her knee. She had chosen to die in the office with the window that looked at the sea. She had made her desk in White Harbor a working altar for years, and children came after to leave pennies on it for luck with numbers and love. Aegon went simply, as sailors do, with the taste of salt on his tongue and Aleser's breath in his hair, and the sailor whose hand he held said later, "Not a king then, just a man," and the world agreed and found that right. Arya lived longer than anyone guessed and died on her feet without noise, like a knife falling into water and not ringing the bowl. Sam went the last, stubborn in his body, until one day he sat very still in the new wing, surrounded by children who may or may not have been listening, and said, "So the point of a story is not to end but to change shape so the next person can pick it up." And then he stopped mid-gesture, palm open as if showing how to hold a bird without making it decide it hates your hand. Jon and Daenerys grew old as they were meant to, because the world likes to see what old looks like when it has been earned. They slept as old lovers do, breathing each other, laughing in their sleep sometimes because laughter goes into bones if you let it. They had the goat. It ate everything, but it learned to leave the ribbons. They held grandchildren who did not care who they were, and then they held them again, because what else is power for but to hold small, ferocious lives until they remember themselves brave. Lyanna stood under the heart tree a last time with sap in her mouth and a hum in her teeth. The pillars thrummed in a way only she could feel entirely. Gyrax lay her head along the curve of her mistress's spine, a touch so light it might have been frost. The droplet under the Hightower lamp and the droplet in the chair and the ones they had not found but that had learned to hum anyway all sang back the same note. Here now, here now, here now. On a dawn when the aurora had decided to be bold, Jon rose with the owls and milkers again. The sky sifted a dusting of cold light. Daenerys came to stand beside him, hair unbound, goats foolish at the garden wall. Regal a long shadow on the yard and then a longer exhale. They looked where men always look when trying to not say goodbye, at nothing in particular. The pillars hummed. The weirwood breathed. Their hands found each other. They did not decide to let go. When men said later they saw a star that had not been there and that it lay exactly above the place where two people had learned to make songs out of fear, no one argued. The Cull called it the Hearth Star. Sailors called it the Lion's Mercy, because sailors name even their own breathe space with complicated jokes. Children called it Dawnfire because children are not wrong as often as songs would have you think. The maesters noted it in careful hands and then spilled ink and laughed because the world had set down its own footnote without asking. Winterfell went on because that is what Winterfell does. The goat grew old and mean and then not mean again. The ribbons never stayed on the horns long, but no one minded. They tied more. In the school at the wall, a teacher wrote on a slate, "When the world sings, what do you do?" A girl in the second row said, loudly, "Shut up and listen." In Old Town the lantern went on, and sometimes, in the hour just after sunset, Gyrax would fly there by herself and lay a kiss of frost along the glass and then will for Winterfell like a pale scrap of thought. At Pike, boys learned to set ear to bone and judge a swell to the hour by its hum and not by how scared they were. In a street in King's Landing where once wildfire had stacked bones 3 high, a baker wrote a song on his floury board each morning and sold it for a penny. You could eat the song and still remember it. Stories find their level. They thicken or thin to fit the cup you pour them into. The realm held many cups, and the song poured into all of them and did not run out. No statue stood taller than the pillars. No sword hung heavier than the plow. A goat stood on a table where no goat had any right to be and looked straight at a queen who was not there anymore and chewed and then stopped and put its head down on the stones and slept. The wind that peeled down off the wall carried that scent again. The rosemary on broken stone, the powdered ice, the dragon's smoke gone sweet. It ran along the corridors and the rivers and the pillars and the ribs at Naga's Hill and the lantern glass at Old Town and the oily stone under it and the droplet in its groove and the disk of ice under the shivering sea and the hands that knew where to place it all. Spoke without words, said hush, listen, lean. And the realm, which had learned something after all that winter and all that dawn, obeyed. Snow lay in all the places Winterfell expected it to lay and none of the places it did not. The keep wore it like an old cloak thrown on in the half-dark and shrugged into shape. Lyanna woke again with sap on her tongue and the line in her teeth. Finer now, taut as a hair on a bough, and knew before she opened her eyes that the pillars were listening to something farther off than last time, as if the horizon had taken 1 pace back. In the great hall they had kept the table bare since the day the stars changed. No banners, no chair higher than another. The room breathed bread and smoke and wet wool. Children had chalked crooked spirals on the flagstones under the benches. The maesters pretended to scowl and then made space for more chalk. Lyanna poured herself barley coffee from a pot that refused to stay warm unless you sang to it. And while she sang 2 notes into the steam, a courier with snow on his shoulders shouldered through the door, shaking hard like a dog. He knelt, then remembered they no longer did that as a first instinct and then bowed instead. "From last light," he panted. The lamp went thin at moonrise. The water stood still though the wind pushed, like a held breath. 3 whales beached and then unbeached themselves when the lamp swelled again. He swallowed. Ser Dennis says the hush was worse than the noise. Lyanna took the strip of vellum and read Ser Dennis Mallister's tidy hand. Ghostfire, again, but stretched, as if a harp string had been drawn across a room too wide for it. She looked up to where Jyrix's pale shadow slid across the rafters. One of the big doors stood ajar, and the dragonlet's breath made lace on the air. "We go," she said aloud, and the hall took it in and exhaled. Aegon would have ridden Elysir ahead in the old days. Not for glory, but because the sea had baked into his bones, and he liked to be first to taste whether it had soured in the night. He was gone. Grief no longer burned like salt in Lyanna's mouth, but it never quite sweetened either. Now it was a taste that sharpened decisions. She found Daenerys's old harness. Oiled, repaired, a buckle replaced by Gendry's apprentices with brass that had the weight right, and lifted it onto Jyrix's shoulders. The pale dragon turned her head and watched with one opal eye, as if remembering hands older than Lyanna's laying leather down. "Hold still," Lyanna murmured, and the dragon did, tail tip drawing a single line in melted frost while the straps settled. They flew with the river, regal a slow emerald sunrise on their right hand, Elysir bright and fretful on their left, keeping too close for Lyanna's comfort until she whistled once and the copper dragon kicked at the air and sulked into a proper patrol slot. The pillars hummed under them, each answering the one before like lamps down a winter lane. Winterfell to Moat Cailin to the neck to the Westwatch towers that had never cared a whit for kings or for summer. Men in fur-rimmed hoods looked up and tipped their caps and then went back to the practical math of nets, because dragons overhead did not salt cod or bale boats. The last light stood on a spit of rock where the mapmaker's line for land rubbed out, and he lifted his quill to ink sea. The lamp, when it was itself, threw a cone of green gold that made sailors straighten and forgive each other old small debts. Today it showed thin as a woman who has sat too long beside a sickbed. The sea bucked at its base, not with whitecaps but with a ripple like the skin of something alive moving under a sheet. Ser Dennis waited under a wind that could not make up its mind which direction meant home. He tilted his gray head when they landed and did not waste words on ceremony. "It came like a hand closing," he said. "The sound did not die. It folded." Men put fingers in their ears and heard nothing different inside. Then it passed and the lamp fattened again, but the whales had already come. "Where?" Lyanna asked. He pointed. A crescent of shingle where kelp piled and the driftwood always smelled of stories. There the three whales had hauled their huge griefs half out of the water and lay shuddering, their sides quivering like bellows. Men with ropes had stood in a kind of useless bravery that was tenderness really, and the whales, after a long terrible while, had slid back into the water as if someone had remembered the right name to call them by. "The hush returned at half-tide," Dennis said. "Shorter that time, as if the first had taught it manners." Lyanna crouched and pressed her palm into the black glass that ringed the lamp's base. The hum came up through her bones to sit behind her eyes. Not wrong, as the chair at Pike had been. Not indifferent, as the oily stone beneath Old Town. Not hungry, as the Night King's cold had always been. Expectant, as if a chorus waited and could not find its pitch until a single woman cleared her throat. "Jyrix," she said softly. The dragon slid along the lantern's housing and put her forehead against the seam where brass met stone. Her breath frosted, then melted. The lamp's thin belly held its breath and then exhaled. The sea forgot its ripple and remembered it was water. "A message," Lyanna said, rising. She tasted sap and salt at once, a note that made the scar in her father's throat warm in her memory. "Not from the Cull, not from the deep singers either. A third voice in our weave. I think—" She stopped, because words could turn a shape into the wrong animal if she wasn't careful. "I think the net reaches something it did not know it touched." "What?" Ser Dennis asked, because men who have sworn to watch must ask even when the answer will not help them stand longer. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I think it remembers us." They held the light through the next glass tide and the next, and when the hush came again it was narrower, like a door that had learned you did not need to push it all the way open to let a friend in. The whales did not return. A cod shoal turned as one and glittered like coins shaken in a bowl. Men in the watch sang a low line under their breath without realizing, and the Cull singers who had come with Lyanna matched it with a harmony so small that the wind did not hear and so strong that the lamp stopped thinking about being thin. Lyanna stayed 2 nights and a day, long enough to learn the new seam of sounds feel. On the 3rd morning, a raven from Old Town found her shoulder. A strip of parchment in Marwyn's hand, ink stamped by rain. The oily stone under the citadel pulses in time with a symptom I do not like to name. The bell in the east tower rang without a hand. Come at once. Beneath, in Missandei's fine script, she had retired to the river but never retired from words. Bring a singer who listens before she answers. They flew with weather at their backs and all the old griefs making room for new obedience in their chests. Old Town wore the same fish and garlic breath as always, but the high tower's face looked different if you knew how to look. The mortar lines held wet as if the stone sweated. The light above burned steady. Lyanna's droplet under the lens sang a small clean note, but in the lower course's shadow pooled. Marwyn met them in a room lined with odds and ends that would have been curiosities in any other man's study, and here were tools. A piece of dragonglass worn into a grip by a hand that had learned to pray without kneeling. An blade with a rune carved where water would never see it. A jar of beetles that glowed faintly green and looked bored with the jar. He was thinner, as if age had burned everything in him that could be burned and left the stubborn part standing. He pointed with a forefinger that had been ink-stained since before Lyanna was born. The hush you felt at last light walked the streets at noon yesterday, he said. It did not kill sound, but it asked it to be polite. The oily stone beneath us took that suggestion as an insult, pulled every not sound tight as a quirt. The bells rang themselves because silence grabbed at their tongues. Where? Lyanna asked, because her father had taught her that where was often better than why when the world first changed. In the old vault, Marwyn said, where the first stones were set, where I once told you to stand very still and let the dark smell your hair. They went. Lyanna, Gyrex pressing pale heat along the walls as she slithered in a shape that did not look nearly large enough to hold a dragon. Jon with his palm on Regal's shoulder above because an old dragon would no longer fit in that throat. Daenerys walking without looking back because looking back changes what you remember and not always for the better. The vault opened like a mouth that had never fully closed. The oily stone lay in layers that did not respect geometry, pouring itself into shapes a human hand would not choose. Sang low, troubled. Lyanna knelt and set her palm to it. The song poured up over her skin like the river running backward. She tasted copper and a fern-green bitterness she had learned under the heart tree. She understood one thing. The stone did not like being asked to stand aside while something moved, though. It had spent too long being told it was a foundation. Could not imagine being a corridor. She took her hand away. If we push, she said, it will push back. We must ask. How? Marwyn said. Do you ask a rock to lend you its throat? Daenerys opened her palm. She did not take out a droplet this time. Those belonged where they had been set, and one did not go fishing pearls from the mouths one had put them into. She showed him instead a coin. It had been hammered from the first melted sword taken from the throne. It bore a wolf and a dragon twined. Its rim bore 3 words in 4 tongues. Lean with me. She had given it to a baker the week she and Jon had decided to salt the city instead of burning it. And the baker had spent it, and it had been found by a child, and that child had bit it and learned it was real. And in the years since it had walked the realm and come back in the pocket of a woman from Lannisport who had paid for a bowl of fish stew with 3 coppers and this, and Missandei had set it aside, and now Daenerys took it to a rock. She set it on the oily stone and sang the smallest note she knew, the hum one uses to comfort a child who has decided tears will be its only language. The coin did not glow. The stone did not crack. It softened imperceptibly, like a fist unclenching one finger to see whether it will be allowed to unclench the next. Again, she said to Lyanna. Lyanna put her palm to the stone. She did not push. She breathed. She hummed the line the Cull had taught her for asking a seal to believe the water would hold its baby while it fed. Gyrex put her forehead to the seam where the stone met the newer-shaped blocks, and her breath drew the same white spider webs it had drawn on the Hightower lens. The hush rose, not an attack, an invitation that had forgot it was an invitation. The stone, grudging and proud and old and not evil, admitted the grossly human possibility that an invitation could be for it as well. In the street above, A baker laid down his peel and wept and then laughed because the knot in his back that had sat there since the day his brother drowned stood up and left. In an alley, a whore put her forehead against the wall and whispered something she had not told anyone since she was 13 and the wall. Elle said it back, not to mock but as proof it had always been listening and just forgot how to shape the word. In the Citadel's east tower, the bell stopped trembling and then, of its own accord and with no rope on its tongue, rang one pure tone that made every apprentice who had ever dropped a pipette stop and pick it up without breaking it. Marwyn wiped his eyes with a knuckle and made an impatient noise that meant he did not mind having his eyes wet, only resented the time it took to dry them. So, he said, the third voice, not the dead, not the deep, not the tree, the stone itself, the old makers, not men, not friends, not enemies, the first architecture of fear, learning to be a room and not a fortress, learning to be a bridge, Lyanna said, and heard the word turn to shape in the stone. We must give it a place to stand while it leans. How? Marwyn said again, because he had made a habit of asking at the precise places where asking pushed the world into the shape for which it had always been pretending not to be ready. By sharing the threshold, Daenerys said. She pressed the coin into a seam where time had made space and left it there. By leaving our weight next to its. They left then because rooms like that only let you in for as long as they can stand your smell. Above, the city looked the way cities look when someone has sung in a low stone room and the song has walked up. Dogs lay with their chins on their paws. A fight that would have ended with a broken nose ended with two men sitting on a curb sharing a figure. The Citadel's white ravens flew in a loose ring and did not look down their beaks for once. The lamp atop the high tower did not gutter. That night, on the tower's lee side, Lyanna and Daenerys stood in the wind and ate mussels from a pot the Tallow-man's wife had thrust into their hands, as if to say, if you insist on talking to stones, at least do it fed. Jon dozed with his back against Rhaegal's shoulder. The old dragon's breath tickled his hair and he smiled in his sleep, just briefly, as if a field of barley had been funny. What do you make of the hush? Lyanna asked. Daenerys ate one mussel and then another and licked her thumb. The sea remembering it does not belong to any of us, she said. The stones remembering they do. The net remembering it was built by hands that do not know everything. She leaned her head against Lyanna's. We have to teach the realm to let silence speak without calling it threat. Keepers of quiet, Lyanna said. Not priests, listeners. One in every watch, one in every hall. They do not hush voices. They hush fear. Daenerys laughed, soft and fierce. You are your mother's child, she said, and Lyanna felt the blessing and the joke both. They called the concord at the equinox, when even the weather admits balance might be interesting. Not a king's moot, not a sep's fast, something between. They held it at last light because that was where the hush had learned its manners, and because a lamp lends courage to those who distrust new doors. The Cull came by skin boat with bells of bone on their wrists that did not tangle. The Ironborn came showing their teeth and left them bare most of 3 days and then decided that was work and put their lips over them now and then like sensible men. Summer Islanders came with drums and with patience that had outlasted 100 petty wars in history's men like to pretend they read. Red priests came and did not catch fire. A silent sister came and nodded when Lyanna made space on the front bench. Maesters came by twos, one to take notes and one to watch the other for lying. They did not stand a dais. They set the lamp between them and the sea around them, and the pillars along the spit hummed low enough that only hearts knew. Lyanna spoke what all knew. The net held. The hush had walked and not struck. The stones had answered. The deep had not withdrawn. The trees kept their old slow counsel. Men kept their old quick faults. Then a boy stood. He had a scar under one eye where a hook had caught him and mended him into a man who would always remember he had been a boy. So when it comes, he said, not bothering to name it because when the world changes you always think you mean the same it. What do we do? Do not shout, said the silent sister, and those who had come to mock found they could not. Do not run, said the Ironborn in oilskin, surprising himself. Do not mistake quiet for consent, said the Summer Islander, and tapped the drum once so gently that men's throats loosened who had not realized they had gone tight. Do not measure with a sword what a song can weigh better, said the Red Priest, who had learned to be sly about gods. "Tell us if the hush comes to your houses," Lyanna said. "We will come listen with you, and if it becomes hunger, we will feed it until it forgets to bite." A woman from the high farms on the Cape rose and said, "If it comes when the lambs are dropping, who holds the legs while the head turns?" And a fisherman from the river said, "I will." And a priest said, "I will." And the Kull elder with the jade lines said, "I will." And they all laughed, but it was the right kind of laugh, the kind that remembers the thing the lamb is doing is a miracle and not just work. So they named the keepers of quiet. Not an order, a habit. Men and women in watch posts and market stalls and salt sheds wore a ribbon not on their arms. Those meant armies. But at their throats, a small strip of dull green or pale ice blue that said, "If you forget how to breathe, look at me and watch." Children learned that touching the ribbon meant wait. Dogs learned too. Winter came soft and then less soft. The way winters do when they feel they have been cheated of teeth and remember there is another way to be winter besides biting. The hush walked the realm like a new kind of weather the first year and then less the second because manners set and then more the third because men grew proud and needed reminding and then less again because pride learned it could sit and keep its mouth shut while someone else sang. Old wrongs did not vanish. They never do. A guild in Karth built high mirror towers and tried to sell maps to the places the hush liked best. Men with money have always thought they can lease awe. The mirrors broke in a storm that mocked geometry and the guild learned humility cheaply. A splinter from the astronomers in Old Town decided the starmen called Dawnfire was an omen that the old faith must be purified and set hands on a pillar with chisels wrapped in velvet. 3 keepers stood between iron and glass and said, "Listen first," and the chisels turned to bells. In Bravos, the sellsword captain swaggered into a tavern and told a story about killing a stone. No one laughed. The tavern keeper poured him one drink and then suggested he might want to go find work on a ship where the songs were honest. Lyanna grew into the shape that fit the world that had grown around her. Not queen, not priest, not maester. Something of each. The goats learned her voice, and it amused her that this kept her humble more efficiently than any sermon. Gyrex grew slow and wide and learned to skim just above wheat without breaking the heads. Regal's breath lengthened and shortened until it finally did not come one winter dawn, and the old dragon lay under a shawl of new snow and looked like a hill that had decided not to breathe for a while. They burned him with the cleanest wood and sang with the low line the Kull had taught for elder whales. When Yara died, it was in a storm on a day she would have chosen. Sitting on the strand above Naga's hill with her boots full of sand and the sea doing its old trick of pretending indifference. The chair hummed in a key it had learned, and the droplet in the groove caught a single bead of rain and held it too long for any man's patience and then let it go because one must, in the end, even if you are a chair. They drank stew and did not try to call what they felt by a better name. The Iron Islands did not ask for tithes in blood that year. They tied ribbons around oars instead and found it did not make the boats go slower. Back at Old Town, the oily stone had learned one more thing: how to be quiet without sulking. Marwyn snorted at it and told it jokes and then dyed himself with his cheek on a page, like Sam, because there are only so many ways men who love books choose to go and most of them are peaceful at last. Missandei wrote his epitaph in 4 tongues and then went down to the river and sat and did not write for an hour for the first time in 40 years. Lyanna kept the habit of waking with sap in her mouth, even when the hush became just another weather. On a morning when frost made white stitches across the pond in the Godswood and the goats had already escaped and were making a mockery of ribbons in the herb bed, she felt something different again. Not a line in the teeth, not a hum, a softness, like moss taking root where nothing had held before. She went out with bare ankles and let the stones tell her where to put her feet. The heart tree listened. The pillars listened. The stones listened under the high tower and under Pike and under the street in King's Landing where once wildfire had made bones and now a baker made songs you could eat. The deep listened under the flows. The hush listened to itself. And far out, not east, not west, not any of the old directions. A place that had never liked being named bared its teeth and then, surprising itself, smiled. That day no raven flew.
No trumpet sounded.
No bell rang without a rope. The wind peeled down off the wall with rosemary and powdered ice and dragon smoke gone sweet. It ran the corridors and the ribs and the glass and the oily stone and the coin in the seam and the droplet under the lamp and the disc under the sea, and everywhere it went the same thing happened, which was not much to look at and everything to feel. Hands found other hands. The goat did not eat the ribbon. A child closed her eyes and knew where to put her feet. A man who had not spoken to his brother in 9 winters stepped into a doorway and said a word that had only ever meant stay. Lioness stood under the heart tree and laid her palm flat and whispered into the wood, "We hear you." Gyrax breathed frost and it did not sting. Somewhere far underwater something huge rolled to show its other side to the sun, though the sun could not see. The pillars hummed the quietest note they had and were content. Far above, in the reach of sky where men put names because that is how they map fear, the star children called Dawnfire did what stars do when the world keeps its promises. It burned, not brighter, not louder, only exactly as it should. The song threaded itself through that fire and came back down as weather, as laughter, as steam off bread, as the line in a woman's teeth that told her the realm had learned one more word for home.